Every one of these men believed, at some point, that they'd covered their tracks completely. Every single one of them was operating under the same basic assumption that if nobody talked and nothing obvious was left behind, the story would simply stay buried with them. A hitman with a genius-level IQ, careful enough to keep his operation invisible for years. A supplier who vanished from a courtroom before the verdict even came down and stayed gone for half a century. A robber whose name should have disappeared with every other forgotten case from his era. A trafficker who thought a border was enough to make him safe. All four of them were wrong, and the reason is the same reason every time. It's never the crime itself that survives. It's the paperwork. A DEA file that never gets closed. A ledger somebody forgot to burn. A wanted poster that stays in circulation decades after anyone stopped actively looking. A single photograph on an album cover that turns a robbery into a piece of cultural history nobody can erase. None of these men were undone by a rival or bad luck or a partner who talked. They were undone by the version of themselves that ended up on paper, in a file, in a ledger, in a photograph, long after they thought that record had stopped mattering. It's worth sitting with why that keeps happening. Across four completely different situations, decades apart, with no connection to each other at all. The crime itself is usually the easy part to plan for. You know when it's happening, you know who's involved. You can control, at least in the moment, who sees what and who doesn't. What almost nobody plans for is the version of events that gets written down by somebody else. An investigator building a file, a journalist keeping notes, a label executive deciding whose face goes on a cover. That documentation doesn't answer to the person it's about. It just sits there, accurate or not, waiting for someone to read it at the exact moment it matters most. Four men, 4 different decades, 4 completely different situations. And in every single one, the paper trail outlasted the man who thought he'd left none. We start with the one who should have been the hardest to catch on paper at all, a hitman smart enough that even the people hunting him couldn't believe what they were reading. February 6th, 1975. Orchard Lake, Michigan. Nice neighborhood, quiet streets, big lawns, the kind of place where nothing happens, where people sleep with their windows open. A rented Oldsmobile is speeding down a narrow road. It comes around a bend and nearly collides head-on with a patrol car. The cop hits his brakes. The Oldsmobile does not stop. High-speed chase. The Oldsmobile runs the police car off the road. More units called. Miles of pursuit through a Detroit suburb that has not seen a crime all year. They finally stop the car. Behind the wheel, a black man, 44 years old, scar tissue across his hands. Calm, not panicked, not running, just sitting there, like he had been expecting this moment his entire life. Officers search the vehicle. 2 semi-automatic pistols, a rifle, a sawed-off shotgun, several ounces of heroin, a stolen police uniform from Toledo, espionage equipment, cash, a lot of cash. But none of that is why 6 law enforcement agencies would spend the next 2 decades fighting over this case. In the trunk, notebooks, handwritten, meticulous, page after page after page, the names and home addresses of over 300 cops, judges, prosecutors, and politicians. The daily habits of recent murder victims documented before they were killed. Sealed grand jury files that no civilian should ever possess. Locations of every safe house, drug den, and witness in the city of Detroit. This man had been running a one-man intelligence operation more sophisticated than anything the Detroit Police Department had ever built. He had cops on payroll running license plates for him through the Law Enforcement Information Network. He had stolen a police uniform and badge. He kept surveillance equipment, disguises, aliases. The officers stared at the notebooks. Then they stared at the man. His name was Chester Wheeler Campbell. He had nicknames: Dr. Death, the Angel of Death, the Undertaker, 007. Federal authorities would later estimate he personally killed over 50 people. He was convicted of murder exactly once, in 1955. Never again. Every witness who tried to testify against him ended up dead. One was found in the protection wing of a maximum security federal prison with his throat cut and X's carved into his eyelids. When Campbell's lawyer was asked about the dead witness, he told the judge something that made the courtroom go silent. Chester does not need to be physically present to conduct business. And the most dangerous thing about Chester Wheeler Campbell was not his gun. It was not his body count. It was not even his near-genius IQ. It was the fact that the Italian Mafia, the Tocco Zerilli crime family, the same organization connected to the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, did not just tolerate this man. They needed him. They funded him. They staked his crew. They gave him their drug supply lines. Because Chester Wheeler Campbell was so good at what he did that Detroit's most powerful crime family could not operate without a black man doing their killing for them. This is the story they never told you. The real 007. The real John Wick. A man who dressed only in black, attended plays and museums, studied foreign languages, kept assassins' notebooks, and built a criminal empire so terrifying that both sides of the law wanted him dead. And when they finally caught him, he looked at his cellmate and said 7 words. "I'm a dead man. Whether I stay in here or get out, brother, I'm dead." Chester Wheeler Campbell was born in 1930 in Detroit. He was the 4th of 6 children. His father died when Chester was in the 2nd grade, and his mother raised 6 kids alone. Here is what made Chester different from every other gangster you have ever heard of. He was the only one in his family who went criminal. 5 siblings, all of them law-abiding, one mother doing her best, and one son who chose a different path. By the age of 15, he was incarcerated for burglary in 1946. A child in a cell. Whatever chance he had at a normal life ended before he could drive. By the age of 20, he faced 2 more burglary charges. His photograph was already displayed in the precinct station house. The cops knew his face, and they were watching him, waiting. They did not have to wait long. On July 1st, 1955, in Detroit, on Lawton Street, Chester was 24 years old. He and 2 partners, David Green and Watson Brooks, planned to rob a numbers spot, a gambling apartment. They masked their faces with handkerchiefs. They had 2 pistols between them. Outside the apartment, they encountered Luther Mixon, 43 years old, standing near an expensive car. The robbers demanded to know who owned it. Mixon said nothing. Campbell pistol whipped him. Mixon fell and tried to get back on his feet. Campbell fired a round into his face. Then they went inside the apartment. Inside were 4 people: John and Julia Jackson, Roosevelt Williams, and Emmett Carter. They robbed them all at gunpoint and beat them. Their total take was $420, including what they pulled from the pockets of the man bleeding out in the street. $420 for a man's life. They arrested Campbell the next day. An officer recognized him from the precinct wall photo, the same photo they had been staring at for years. The witnesses from the apartment identified him in a lineup. He was charged with first-degree murder in January 1956 and sent to Michigan State Prison, known as Jackson Prison, one of the most violent penitentiaries in America. Chester Wheeler Campbell walked in as a street robber who killed a man over $420. 13 years later, he walked out as something else entirely. Here's what nobody expected. Campbell didn't waste a single day inside Jackson Prison. While other inmates fought and gambled and waited for parole, Chester studied. He studied criminal law, homicide investigation techniques, and foreign languages. He read everything he could find: books on surveillance, books on espionage, books on forensics. He scored near genius level on a court-administered IQ test. He learned new criminal trades from the most dangerous men in Michigan: safe cracking, weapons, drug distribution networks, the economics of heroin, who controlled what in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago. 13 years. That's how long Chester Wheeler Campbell spent preparing for what came next. In September 1969, he pleaded his case down to second-degree murder. The court transcript is chilling because of how calm he is. The judge asked, "Do you know where he was killed?" Campbell answered, "On the street." The judge said, "Tell me the circumstances." Campbell said, "In the process, I shot Mr. Mixon." The judge asked, "After that, what happened?" Campbell said, "I think I went through his pockets." He said it like he was recalling a trip to the grocery store. No remorse, no emotion, just facts. They paroled him in September 1969. He was 38 years old. Within 1 month, police suspected him in a double homicide. Jimmy Davis and his girlfriend Lisa were both shot execution style in the head while sitting in a parked car. Davis had been a protected witness in trials against heroin kingpin John Klassen. The man who was supposed to be safe, who the government promised to protect, was dead with a bullet in his brain within weeks of Chester Wheeler Campbell walking free. But they could not prove it. No witnesses, no evidence connecting Campbell directly. That became the pattern. That was always the pattern. And what Chester did next would make the Italian mafia take notice. After prison, Chester Wheeler Campbell did not become a drug dealer. He did not become a gang leader. He did not try to build an empire. He became something far more valuable and far more dangerous: a freelance assassin, available to anyone who could pay his fee. His fee was $15,000 per hit, an astronomical, almost unheard of amount in Detroit in the 1970s. But people paid it because Chester Wheeler Campbell did not just kill. He was an artist of death. He wore only black, head to toe, every day, to accentuate what he called his morbid aura. He wanted you to see him coming and to know what he was before he opened his mouth. Here is the contradiction that made him terrifying. This man, this contract killer, spent his free time attending plays, browsing museums, and studying foreign languages. He was cultured, well-spoken, and surprisingly charming. He could walk into a room full of educated people and nobody would suspect what he was. Then he could walk out of that room and execute someone in a parked car before dinner. He used aliases, Augustus Miller and others. He maintained disguises. He had a stolen Toledo police uniform, complete with badge and commander's hat, that he used for surveillance and infiltration. The badge had been reported lost by a Toledo officer who said he misplaced it while helping a disabled motorist. Campbell had probably taken it from a corrupt cop on his payroll. And the notebooks. Always the notebooks. From the moment he left Jackson Prison, Chester began building something unprecedented, a personal intelligence database. Every contact, every conversation, every license plate, every address, every habit of every person, criminal or cop, who crossed his path. He gathered information through surveillance, gossip, shadowing, payoffs, and simply talking to people, from mobsters to motorcycle clubs, hookers to hitmen, pushers to pimps, Detroit to Cleveland. He made the rounds and he wrote everything down. This was not a street thug keeping a score sheet. This was a spy operation run by one man out of the trunk of a rented Oldsmobile. He even had access to the Law Enforcement Information Network, spelled LEIN, the police database. Cops on the drug lord's payroll would run plates for him. He could identify any car, find any address, and track any person. He once told friends at a bar, drink in hand with a slight grin, that he was one of God's unfortunate creatures. He said it like a joke. It was not a joke. Picture the Louisade Social Club, East Side Detroit, early 1970s, a private Italian social club. The kind of place where men in pressed shirts drink espresso and talk business in half sentences, where the walls have no ears because nobody walks in without an invitation. Anthony Giacalone, known as Tony Jack, sits at a table. His brother Vito Giacalone, known as Billy Jack, sits beside him. These are the street-level commanders of the Taco Zerilli crime family, the Detroit Mafia. Tony Jack would later become infamous as one of the men connected to the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa on July 30th, 1975. That's who we're talking about. A black man walks through the door, head to toe in black. Nobody stops him. Nobody questions him. In a room where no black man should be welcome, Chester Wheeler Campbell sits down at the table. Because the Giacalones had a problem. The heroin trade was exploding, and whoever controlled heroin controlled Detroit. But the old arrangement was dying. The quiet, black, gambling bosses, who had worked for the Italians for years, doing what they were told, staying in their lane, were being replaced. A new generation, independent thinkers, volatile drug kingpins, men who didn't want to pay tribute to the Italians anymore. The Giacalones needed someone who could move through Detroit's black neighborhoods without standing out. Someone who could enforce their heroin operations in territories where an Italian face meant a bullet. Someone whose reputation alone could keep an entire side of the city in line. They didn't find that man. That man found them. Chester Wheeler. Campbell had been freelancing since prison, killing for whoever paid. But the Giacalones offered something better than a fee. They offered infrastructure, supply lines, protection, money, a permanent position in the most powerful crime organization in Michigan. Not as an employee, not as a servant, as their chosen weapon. Campbell was placed in the East Side camp, connected to a crew of black enforcers working directly under the Giacalone wing. Contract killers, extortionists, drug traffickers, a subunit of the Italian mafia staffed entirely by black men. They would later be called Murder Row, and Chester Wheeler Campbell was the reason anyone feared that name. Around late 1973, Campbell was introduced through mutual acquaintances in the mafia to two young East Side heroin dealers, Frank Usher, known as Big Frank Nitti, and Harold Morton, known as the Hawk. The Giacalone brothers had given Usher his nickname, Big Frank Nitti, after the real Chicago mobster. That tells you everything about the relationship. The Italians weren't just doing business with these men. They were mentoring them, shaping them, building them in their own image. Usher and Morton had ambition. What they lacked was fear. Nobody was afraid of two young dealers. Every corner had young dealers. Then Chester Campbell walked in. Here's how it worked. A dealer owed money, hadn't paid in weeks, thought he could outrun the debt. Campbell didn't chase him, didn't threaten him. He just parked outside the man's house in the morning, in the same rented car, in the same all-black clothes, in the same spot. For 3 days, never got out, never knocked, never said a word. On the 4th day, the man walked out with an envelope full of cash and handed it through the window. That was Chester when things went well. When things didn't go well, bodies turned up in parked cars with bullets in the back of the head and no witnesses within miles. With Campbell's reputation, the Giacalone brothers' money and supply lines, and Usher's ambition, Murder Row became the most powerful drug operation in the entire state of Michigan. Not Detroit, not the East Side, the entire state. The Michigan Federated Democratic Social Club in Midtown became their headquarters. From there, Murder Row expanded operations citywide: gambling, extortion, prostitution. But heroin was the engine. Heroin was always the engine. And here's the thing that nobody talks about. Through all of this, the killings, the heroin, the Italian mafia, Chester's mother was still alive, still in Detroit, still the same woman who raised 6 kids alone after her husband died. 5 of those kids turned out fine, church-going, law-abiding. And then there was Chester, the son who dressed in all black and came home for dinner with blood on his reputation and cash in his pockets that his mother knew better than to ask about. She never disowned him. He never stopped visiting. That's the part of Chester Wheeler Campbell that doesn't fit the legend. The part that reminds you he was a human being. A man who scored near genius on an IQ test, who could have been anything, who had a mother who loved him, and who chose to become the most feared killer in Detroit anyway. Because everyone in that city's underworld knew the same thing. If you crossed Murder Row, Chester would find you. He already had your name in his notebook. He already knew your address. He already knew what car you drove. The question wasn't whether he could find you. The question was whether you'd see him first. Chester Campbell was suspected in at least 10 homicide investigations between 1969 and 1975. 10 that police knew about. The real number, according to federal authorities, was north of 50. He was never convicted. Not because police didn't try. They tried constantly. They built cases. They found witnesses. They prepared prosecutions. Then the witnesses died. In 1971, he was charged with intent to murder a star witness in a drug trial. The charges were dropped before trial. Then came the Roy Parsons case, a 1972 murder. Police had their witness, a man named James Lee Newton, street name Watusi Slim. Watusi Slim wasn't some random bystander. He was a one-time Campbell confidant and business partner. He knew everything. He could connect Chester to murders going back years. The prosecution thought they finally had the case that would put Campbell away forever. They put Watusi Slim in protective custody, a maximum security federal prison in Ohio. The protection wing, the safest place the government could put a human being short of an underground bunker. It didn't matter. Watusi Slim was found dead, throat cut, eyelids marked with X's, in the protection wing of a maximum security federal prison. The X's on the eyelids. Think about that. That wasn't just murder. That was a message. To every potential witness in every pending case against Chester Wheeler Campbell, we can reach you anywhere, even in the one place the government swears is safe. All murder charges against Campbell were dropped. His lawyer stood before the judge and said it plainly. No shame, no apology. Words that echoed through Detroit's legal system like a gunshot. Chester doesn't need to be physically present to conduct business. The judge heard it. The prosecutors heard it. Every cop in Detroit heard it, and nobody could do a thing about it. When they searched his house in Detroit and his girlfriend's home in Orchard Lake, the picture got worse. Documents bearing the names, addresses, and personal details of cops, politicians, judges, gangsters, addicts, witnesses, and prosecutors, sealed grand jury files, espionage equipment, the stolen Toledo police uniform and badge, an estimated $250,000 in cash, and a list. What prosecutors would call a hit list. The names and daily habits of people who were already dead, alongside names of people who were still alive. The implication was obvious. The living names were next. Among those names, L. Brooks Patterson, a well-known assistant prosecutor in Oakland County, who would later call Campbell absolutely incorrigible and a dedicated recidivist. 6 law enforcement agencies, Detroit Police, Oakland County, Wayne County, the FBI, the DEA, and the ATF, immediately began fighting over the notebooks. Not cooperating, fighting, because whoever controlled Chester Campbell's intelligence had leverage over the entire Detroit underworld and the police forces that were supposed to be clean. The corruption ran that deep. The Detroit Free Press covered it obsessively. The notebooks didn't just expose criminals, they exposed the true extent of Detroit's rot. Cover-ups, bribes, homicides, espionage, racism, addiction, rampant greed. And Chester knew it. In his cell, he reportedly told a fellow inmate, "I'm a dead man. Whether I stay in here or get out, brother, I'm dead." He wasn't wrong, just not in the way he expected. With Campbell locked up, Murder Row was finished. Not immediately, but inevitably. Chester had been the fear. Without him, the crew was just drug dealers with guns, and Detroit had 1,000 of those. The power inside Murder Row shifted. A lieutenant named Doc Holliday, real name Clarence Hillary, had been waiting for his moment. With Chester gone, Doc decided the leadership needed to change, violently. One night in 1979, at the Michigan Federated Democratic Social Club, Murder Row's own headquarters, Doc Holliday ordered 3 men killed. Not rivals, not enemies. His own people, James McJoy, Herbert Jackson, Alvin Clark. 3 Murder Row members who had sided with Frank Usher over Doc in the internal struggle for control. They were shot. Then it got worse. Doc ordered the bodies dismembered, heads removed, limbs separated, body parts placed into garbage bags. And he forced Frank Usher, the founder of Murder Row, the man the Giacalones had personally mentored, to participate, to pick up a blade and cut apart the bodies of men who had been loyal to him. While it happened, Doc Holliday popped a bottle of champagne, lit a fat cigar, and celebrated. Then he sent 2 men to dump the garbage bags. They were sloppy. The remains were found. The case unraveled. Usher was convicted. Doc Holliday was acquitted, but the streets have their own justice system. In 1983, someone walked up to Doc while he was having a drink at a Detroit night spot and shot him dead. The Giacalone brothers watched all of this from a distance. They had lost their enforcer. Then they had lost their crew. The most powerful black drug operation in Michigan, the one they had personally funded and built, destroyed itself in 4 years without Chester Wheeler Campbell to hold it together. They moved on. They always moved on. New crews, new enforcers, new faces, but they never found another Chester. Campbell was convicted on weapons and drug charges in Oakland County, 40 to 60 months. Wayne County added 20 to 30 months under the habitual offender statute, federal charges for the sawed-off shotgun stacked on top. He fought for his money from prison. He filed dozens of legal briefs. He railed against everyone. The courts actually ruled in his favor and ordered the $250,000 returned. But by then, the IRS had taken it. The money was gone forever. He also orchestrated things from inside. A plot to kidnap 4 judges was discovered and traced back to Campbell while he was sitting in Oakland County Jail. All 20 of Detroit's recorder's court judges received extra security from a man in a cell. Chester doesn't need to be physically present to conduct business. September 1984. He was paroled. He walked out into a different Detroit. Murder Row was dead. The Giacalones had moved on. The heroin game had changed. Crack was coming. New players, young players, players who had never heard of Chester Wheeler Campbell. But Chester didn't know how to be anything else. April 1985, 7 months after release, somebody shot Chester Wheeler Campbell multiple times in the leg and thigh. An 11-hour surgery saved his life. Reporters showed up at the hospital. Cameras, microphones, questions about who shot him, why, and what he planned to do about it. Chester Wheeler Campbell, the man who had killed 50 people, who had the Italian mafia on speed dial, who had kept notebooks on every cop in Detroit, looked at the reporters and said, "I don't have anything newsworthy to say." Then he went back to work. In 1987, déjà vu, Chester Wheeler Campbell was pulled over again. Same story, different year. A carload of guns, drugs, explosives, spy gear. Prosecutor L. Brooks Patterson, the same man whose name had appeared in Campbell's notebooks 12 years earlier, stood in court and called Campbell absolutely incorrigible, a dedicated recidivist and a heavy-duty criminal. The sentence was 40 years. Chester was 57 years old. He was never coming home, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. For the next 14 years, Chester Wheeler Campbell sat in a federal prison. The man who only wore black. The man who went to museums and plays. The man who studied foreign languages and kept a spy operation in his trunk. The man the Italian mafia chose above all others. He died on a prison bed in a federal medical facility in 2001. The official cause of death was end-stage liver disease, hepatitis C, natural causes. Chester Wheeler Campbell, Dr. Death, the Angel of Death, the Undertaker, 007, died of natural causes. He was 71 years old. Here's what stays with me. Chester Wheeler. Campbell killed over 50 people. He was convicted of murder exactly once in 1955 for $420. He spent 30 of his 71 years behind bars. Not for the 50-plus murders, for guns, for drugs, for being caught with the wrong things in the wrong car at the wrong time. Every witness who tried to put him away for what he actually did ended up dead, including one in the most protected facility the United States government could provide. Throat cut, X marks on his eyelids. The Italian mafia, one of the most powerful crime organizations in American history, chose a black man from Detroit as their most trusted weapon. Not an employee, not a tool, a partner. A man they funded, protected, and needed. And the thing that scared everyone, cops, mobsters, prosecutors, judges, drug dealers, witnesses, wasn't the guns, it wasn't the body count, it was the notebooks. Because Chester Wheeler Campbell understood something that most criminals never grasp. Information is more dangerous than any weapon ever made. A bullet kills one person. A notebook with the right names, the right addresses, the right secrets, controls an entire city. He gathered intelligence the way a spy would: surveillance, payoffs, shadowing, contacts. He tracked everyone, and he wrote it all down. When they found those notebooks in the trunk of that Oldsmobile, 6 law enforcement agencies went to war with each other, not to bring Campbell to justice, but to control the information he had collected. Inside those pages were every dirty secret Detroit had been hiding for a decade. Those notebooks were the real weapon. That's the real story of Chester Wheeler Campbell. Not just a hitman, not just a killer. A man who turned knowledge into the most terrifying weapon in Detroit. The real John Wick did not exist in a movie. He drove a rented Oldsmobile through Orchard Lake, Michigan. The only thing that stopped him was not a rival gang, not the FBI, not the Italian mafia. It was a narrow road and a patrol car coming the other direction. One near collision. That was all that separated Chester Wheeler Campbell from never being caught at all. Even a man that careful left behind exactly the kind of documentation that eventually caught up with him, the kind of detail that only reads as significant once someone else is looking for it, years after it was written. The next case took a different path entirely. Not a file that got read too late, but a file that never got closed at all. On July 2nd, 1973, a 29-year-old drug kingpin named Frank Matthews was supposed to walk into a Brooklyn federal courthouse and face charges that could put him away for 50 years. He never showed. Instead, Frank Matthews, known on the streets as Black Caesar, emptied his safety deposit boxes, picked up his girlfriend Cheryl Denise Brown, and vanished from the face of the earth. He left behind somewhere between $15 and $20 million of a previous life. He left behind a mansion in Staten Island's most exclusive neighborhood, directly across the street from Gambino boss Paul Castellano. He left behind an empire that stretched across 21 states, 2 drug mills in Brooklyn, fortified with steel walls and armed guards, and a closet in his apartment that a visiting dealer once described as packed to eye level with stacks of cash. But most importantly, Frank Matthews left behind 3 young boys and a woman named Barbara Hinton. Barbara was his common-law wife. She had stood beside him through the flashiest years of his rise, the luxury cars, the prime seats at every sporting event, the Las Vegas trips, the fur coats, the rings. She had watched him become the first black drug trafficker in American history to bypass the Italian mafia entirely and establish direct connections to the French Connection heroin pipeline. She had watched him grow so powerful that the DEA would eventually rank him among the top 10 drug traffickers in United States history. And then, on one hot summer morning, she watched him choose his girlfriend over his family, his freedom over his sons, and $20 million over everything they had built together. The FBI raided the Staten Island mansion. They found an empty safe. Frank Matthews was gone. That was 52 years ago. He has never been found. No fingerprints, no confirmed sightings, no body, no arrest. In December 2025, federal authorities officially ended their search. But what happened to the woman and the 3 boys he left behind? That story, the story nobody tells, might be the most haunting part of the Frank Matthews legend. When Frank Matthews disappeared, the federal government did not just lose a fugitive, they lost their entire case. And they were furious. Their first move was predictable. They went straight to Barbara Hinton. Federal agents descended on the Ocean Parkway apartment in Brooklyn, where Barbara had been living with the 3 boys after the IRS seized their Staten Island mansion. They wanted to know where Frank was. They wanted her to cooperate. They offered full immunity, full protection, a clean slate, if she would tell them anything about her husband's whereabouts, his plans, his contacts, or his escape route. Barbara Hinton refused. The prosecutors did not stop there. They hauled her before a federal grand jury. They pressed her. They threatened her with conspiracy charges, the same charges her husband was facing. They made it clear that if she did not talk, she would pay. Barbara still refused. When agents asked her about Frank Matthews, she gave them a response that became legendary in law enforcement circles. She said she had never heard of a man named Frank Matthews. For 53 years, Barbara Hinton maintained that position. She never cooperated. She never gave authorities a single word. She never remarried. She raised those 3 boys alone, in the shadow of a man the entire federal government was hunting, and she never once broke. The government eventually indicted her. In the 1975 trial of Matthews's associates, 18 members of what the New York Daily News called a black narcotics ring, Barbara was among the defendants. Her lawyer, Gino Galena, argued that the prosecution was an act of retaliation. He told the court that Barbara had been indicted not because she was guilty of drug trafficking, but because she refused to tell the government where Frank Matthews was hiding. According to court transcripts, Barbara maintained that she believed Matthews was dead. Government agents believed she was concealing the information. that she knew exactly where he was. Her case went through the appeals process, with her attorneys arguing bad faith prosecution and claiming the government was using the indictment as leverage to force her cooperation. It didn't work. Barbara never talked. Think about what that means. A woman with 3 children, no visible income after the government seized everything, facing federal conspiracy charges, being told by prosecutors that her life could be destroyed, and she chose silence. Not once, not for a week, for over half a century. Frank Matthews' 3 sons were young children when their father vanished. The oldest was barely old enough to form memories. The youngest may not have remembered him at all. They grew up in the long shadow of a man the whole world was looking for, but who never came home. Before the disappearance, those boys had lived a life most children could not imagine. Matthews had hired a private tutor named Keith Diamond to educate his 3 sons, not at a school, but personally in 1971 at the height of his empire. Diamond was later interviewed for a documentary about Matthews, and he remains one of the few people who spoke about the family's private life. He described a household defined by wealth, loyalty, and an almost surreal level of luxury funded entirely by narcotics. The boys had everything: toys, clothes, a mansion on Tot Hill where mafia bosses were their neighbors, a father who came home in silk suits and drove cars that cost more than most people's houses. Diamond also described something else. He described a father who, despite everything, was present. Matthews would sit with his sons at dinner. He would ask about their studies. He was generous to a fault, not just with his family, but with strangers. Dealers who visited his apartment said he kept a closet packed to eye level with cash, and he gave away money the way other men gave away handshakes. He paid for neighborhood kids to go to college. He bought groceries for families who could not afford them. He threw parties where everyone ate for free. That was what the boys remembered, or what they were told they should remember. A father who was powerful and generous and larger than life. A man who walked into a room and owned it. A man people respected, feared, and loved in equal measure. And then one morning, that man was gone. What do you tell a 5-year-old whose father has just disappeared? What do you tell a 7-year-old? Barbara had to make a choice that no mother should ever have to make. She could not say he was in prison because he was not. She could not say he was dead because she did not believe that. She could not say he had abandoned them because the Christmas packages suggested otherwise. So she said nothing. She protected them the only way she knew how, with silence. The boys grew up with fragments. A photograph here. A story overheard from an uncle or a family friend. A name whispered in a barber shop. They knew their father was famous, but not the way athletes or musicians are famous. He was famous the way ghosts are famous. Everyone had heard of him. Nobody had seen him. As they got older, the questions got harder. Other kids had fathers at their basketball games, at their graduations, at their weddings. The Matthews boys had a legend. They had a name that made federal agents sit up straight. They had a face on a wanted poster that was aging in a database somewhere, while their real father, if he was alive, was aging somewhere else entirely, in a country they had never been to, living a life they would never know. The cruelest part was not the absence itself. It was the ambiguity. If Frank Matthews had died, they could have mourned. If he had gone to prison, they could have visited. But he had done something worse than either of those things. He had left the door open. He had disappeared into a question mark, and that question mark hung over every holiday, every birthday, every moment where a father should have been standing but was not. People who knew the family said the sons handled it differently. Some carried anger, Some carried pride. Some carried both at the same time, furious at a man who had chosen a girlfriend and a suitcase of cash over his own children, but secretly proud that their father had done something no other fugitive in American history had ever accomplished. He had beaten the FBI, the DEA, the IRS, the U.S. Marshals, and the Italian Mafia, all at the same time. And he had never been caught. That is a complicated inheritance. You cannot spend it. You cannot frame it. You cannot put it on a shelf. But you carry it everywhere. Then it was all gone. The mansion seized. The cars taken. The money, whatever Frank did not take with him, was confiscated or spent. Barbara was fighting federal charges. The boys went from being the sons of the most powerful black drug trafficker in America to being the sons of nobody, a ghost. They never got to confront him. They never got to ask him why. They never got to hear his voice explain what he was thinking on that July morning in 1973 when he chose to walk away from everything. They never got the one thing every child of an absent father wants more than anything else in the world, a reason. But here is where the legend gets strange. Over the decades, whispers circulated through the streets and through the networks of people who had known Frank Matthews. The stories were always the same shape. Frank was alive. Frank was somewhere warm. Frank had not forgotten his family. Money occasionally arrived for Barbara and the boys after the disappearance. Not through banks, not through wire transfers. Through people, intermediaries who appeared, delivered, and vanished without explanation. The most famous incident came during Christmas, not long after the disappearance. A package arrived at the family's Brooklyn apartment. Inside was $300,000 in cash. No return address, no card, no signature, just banded stacks of bills, the kind of money that does not come from a savings account. The kind of money that comes from a man who left with $20 million. Barbara never reported it. She never told the authorities. She never spent it in ways that would draw attention. She simply absorbed it into the quiet life she was building for her boys, the same way she absorbed everything else silently, without explanation, without ever acknowledging where it came from or who sent it. But the Christmas money was not the only signal. Over the years, strange messages reached the family through channels that law enforcement could never trace. A phone call from an unknown number, a letter with no return address, postmarked from a country that meant nothing to the agents surveilling the family, but everything to the people inside that apartment. A message passed through a third party, then a fourth, then a fifth, each link in the chain, knowing only the person before them and the person after, never the origin. Classic compartmentalization. The same method Matthews had used to run a 21-state drug empire without a single wiretap catching him for 7 years. The family never confirmed these contacts publicly. They never denied them either. But people close to the family, associates from the old days, people who had worked for Matthews, people who had been in his orbit, said the same thing for decades. Frank was alive. Frank was somewhere warm. And Frank had not forgotten his sons. The documentary producers who made the Frank Matthews story in 2012 conducted roughly 20 interviews with law enforcement, with former associates, with people from Matthews' Baltimore and Brooklyn networks. One of the filmmakers said afterward that reading between the lines of some of the law enforcement interviews, there appeared to be real evidence suggesting Matthews was alive and potentially living in the United States. The U.S. Marshals Service, which handled the fugitive case, was said to believe he was still alive as recently as the 2010s. Cheryl Denise Brown, the girlfriend who disappeared with Matthews, was never found either. Her parents were extensively questioned by authorities. At one point, Brown's parents traveled to Curacao, an island near Venezuela, which added another layer of intrigue. Venezuela was where Matthews's original drug connection, Spanish Raymond Marquez, had fled years earlier. It was where the cocaine came from. It was the one country where Matthews already had infrastructure, contacts, and people who owed him. One investigator reported that a month after the disappearance, IRS agents rushed to a bank in North Carolina after receiving a tip. The bank manager told them they had just missed him. After that, nothing. No fingerprints, no sightings, no confirmed contacts with family members, at least none that federal authorities could prove. The family's silence is itself a kind of testimony. When you look at the facts objectively, there are two theories about what happened to Frank Matthews. The first is that he was killed, possibly by the Genovese crime family, who had reason to want him dead. Matthews had tangled with Genovese associate Ernie Coco Corraluzzo over a 40-kilogram heroin deal at the Waldorf Astoria. When Corraluzzo tried to scam him, Matthews kidnapped his bodyguard. That kind of disrespect toward La Cosa Nostra did not go unpunished in 1973. Under this theory, Matthews was murdered shortly after fleeing, and his body was disposed of. The second theory is that he made it out, that with $20 million, equivalent to roughly $100 million today, and connections stretching from Venezuela to the Caribbean to West Africa, Frank Matthews had the resources, the contacts, and the intelligence to disappear permanently. He had spent years building drug distribution networks that operated in 21 states without being detected. He had stewardesses smuggling heroin in flight bags. He had laundering operations in Las Vegas. He had direct connections to the Corsican underworld in Caracas. If anyone had the infrastructure to vanish, it was him. And the family's behavior tracks with the second theory. Barbara Hinton never cooperated, not once in 53 years. She never remarried. She never publicly mourned Frank as a dead man. She raised those three boys alone and kept her silence with a discipline that suggests she had a reason to stay quiet beyond mere stubbornness. The sons grew up private, never publicly revealing contact, but also never publicly accepting that their father was dead. No funeral was ever held, no memorial, no closure, just silence. In the world of organized crime, that kind of silence has a name. It is called protection. In December 2025, after 52 years, federal authorities officially ended their search for Frank Matthews. The FBI closed the case. The DEA moved on. The $20,000 reward, once the highest in federal history and matching the bounty on John Dillinger, was retired. The announcement barely made the news. A paragraph in a few outlets, a mention on a true crime podcast. For the federal government, it was paperwork, the closing of a file that had gathered dust for decades. For the three sons of Frank Matthews, it was something else entirely. If Frank Matthews is still alive, he would be 81 years old. He disappeared at 29. He has been missing for longer than most people's entire adult lives. His sons are now men in their 50s, older than their father was when he vanished. They have their own children now, maybe grandchildren. An entire generation that has never met the man whose blood runs through their veins, whose name still makes federal agents pause, whose face, frozen in a handful of photographs from 1972, stares out from a wanted poster that no longer means anything to anyone except the people in that Brooklyn apartment who watched him leave and never come back. Think about what those sons have carried. Every time they looked in the mirror and saw their father's jawline. Every time someone recognized the last name. Every time a stranger asked what their father did for a living, and they had to decide in a split second whether to lie, deflect, or tell a truth that sounds like fiction. My father was the biggest drug dealer in America. He disappeared with $20 million. Nobody has found him in 50 years. He might be alive. He might be dead. I don't know. I've never known. Barbara Hinton kept her secret, whatever it was, to the very end. She outlasted every federal agent who ever questioned her, every prosecutor who ever threatened her, every investigator who ever tried to break her. She never gave them a single word. She never gave her sons a straight answer either. Or if she did, they never shared it with the world. There is no ending to this story. That's the point. That's what makes it different from every other crime story ever told. Frank Lucas got caught, Nicky Barnes got caught, El Chapo got caught, even the ones who died, Bumpy Johnson and Pablo Escobar, at least had endings. Their families knew. The world knew. Frank Matthews has no ending, just a family that waited, and a silence that lasted half a century, and 3 boys who became men without ever hearing their father's voice again. Somewhere, maybe, an 81-year-old man is sitting on a porch in a country with no extradition treaty, watching the sun go down, thinking about 3 sons he hasn't held since they were children. Maybe he knows their names. Maybe he knows what they look like now. Maybe he's seen photographs pass through the same invisible network that delivered $300,000 on Christmas morning. Or maybe he's been dead since 1973, and the silence was for nothing, and those 3 boys spent their whole lives waiting for a ghost. Nobody knows, and after 52 years, nobody ever will. Halfway through, and neither of these men outran the paperwork, even the one who's still technically missing. If you want more of this, real cases, built from the actual record, subscribe. 2 more to go, and the next one is the strangest paper trail of the 4. New York City, 1985. A man is leaving a club on the Lower East Side. Gold chain around his neck, cash in his pocket. The kind of night where everything feels like it belongs to you, where the music was right and the city outside feels like yours. He doesn't see it coming. Someone steps out of the dark, takes the chain, takes the cash, takes everything worth taking, and disappears before anyone can process what just happened. No name given, no face remembered clearly, just gone, back into the Brooklyn night like he was never there. But everyone in that world knows who does this. His name moves through the underground economy of New York the way fire moves through dry grass. Dealers talk about him. Kingpins warn their people about him. Men who have built reputations through years of violence speak his name with a specific kind of respect, the kind reserved for someone who operates by rules that even the most dangerous men in the room don't fully understand. He robbed everyone: dealers, runners, kingpins, and eventually the most famous rappers in New York City. Men with bodyguards and reputations and the kind of street credibility that was supposed to make them untouchable. Nobody was untouchable to him, and the greatest rapper who ever lived, the God MC himself, put him on his album cover. His name was Benjamin O'Garrow. Fort Greene, Brooklyn. They called him Killer Ben N. Fort Greene, Brooklyn, 1960s and 70s. The Walt Whitman houses sit on Myrtle Avenue in one of Brooklyn's most historically layered neighborhoods, named after the poet who lived in Fort Greene in the 19th century. Walt Whitman, the man who wrote Leaves of Grass, who celebrated the democratic American spirit, who believed in the dignity of every human life, had his name on a housing project that would become one of the most dangerous addresses in the 1980s in Brooklyn. The irony of that naming is something Fort Greene residents lived with every day. The poet who wrote about democracy and dignity, the building where dignity was one of the hardest things to hold on to. Fort Greene was not always dangerous. In the 1950s and 60s, it had been a working-class neighborhood with a strong black community, families who had migrated from the South during the Great Migration, who had built lives in Brooklyn, who owned small businesses and attended the same churches and sent their children to the same schools. The neighborhood had culture. The Brooklyn Academy of Music sat on Lafayette Avenue. Fort Greene Park, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, the same man who designed Central Park, gave the neighborhood green space and dignity. The Fort Greene houses, built in the 1940s, had originally been considered a model of public housing, clean, safe, well-managed. Then the money left. As white families fled Brooklyn for the suburbs through the 1960s, the city's investment in Fort Greene's infrastructure went with them. Buildings that had been maintained fell into disrepair. Schools that had been funded were starved of resources. The economic floor that had held the community stable began to crack. By the 1970s, Fort Greene was struggling. By the time Benjamin O'Garrow was a teenager in the early 1980s, the crack cocaine epidemic had finished what the disinvestment had started. Crack changed Fort Greene the way it changed every black neighborhood in New York. Not gradually, overnight. Suddenly, there was a drug that cost less than a meal, but created the kind of addiction that made people sell everything they owned. Suddenly, there was money, more money than most residents had ever seen, available on corners to young men who were willing to do what it took to get it. The violence that came with it was specific and relentless. Benjamin O'Garrow grew up in all of that. He made a specific decision about what kind of man he was going to be. Not a dealer, not someone who stood on a corner selling to addicts, not a kingpin building a distribution network that required management and discipline and the careful cultivation of supplier relationships. A stick-up kid, the most feared kind of criminal in the underground economy, because he didn't follow any of its rules. Dealers had codes. There were things you didn't do. You didn't rob civilians. You didn't bring violence near children. You didn't target the wrong people. Kingpins had alliances, agreements, territories that were respected because respecting them was in everyone's interest. Stick-up kids operated outside all of it. They robbed dealers, robbed runners, robbed anyone who was carrying something worth taking. What made Killer Ben different from other stick-up kids in a borough full of dangerous men was his fearlessness. Not recklessness, fearlessness. There is a difference. Reckless men take stupid risks because they don't fully process consequences. Fearless men take calculated risks because they have decided that consequences don't change what they're going to do anyway. Benjamin O'Garrow was the second kind. He would walk into situations that other men would assess and walk away from. He would target people who other stick-up kids considered untouchable because nobody was untouchable to Killer Ben. He operated by a single principle. If you had it, he could take it. That reputation spread through Brooklyn the way reputations spread, through stories, through accounts, circulating in prison yards and on corners, and through the oral history that the streets maintain about the men who matter. By the time he was in his early 20s, Benjamin O'Garrow's name carried weight that most men spend entire careers trying to accumulate. He had earned it the hard way, the only way he knew. Here is the detail that separates Killer Ben from every other Brooklyn stick-up kid. In the mid-1980s, a DJ named Eric B. was building something new. He had found a rapper from Wyandanch, Long Island, a young man who called himself Rakim Allah, whose lyrical sophistication was unlike anything that had existed in hip-hop before. Where other rappers of the era used simple rhyme patterns and straightforward storytelling, Rakim moved between bars with a fluid, almost jazz-like rhythm. He referenced philosophy and scripture. He approached the microphone with the calm authority of a man who knew he was the best in the room. Together, Eric B. and Rakim were building what would become one of the greatest debut albums in the history of American music. They called it Paid in Full, and the name came from a specific source. The Paid in Full Posse was a real organization, a notorious New York collective of street figures and rappers who moved through the same world simultaneously. Men who existed at the intersection of hip-hop culture and the underground economy. Men who were present at the same parties, the same clubs, the same corners where the music and the streets overlapped. The Paid in Full Posse included Kool G Rap, one of the most technically gifted rappers of the era, Freddie Fox, an MC whose intensity was unmatched, and two men who were not rappers at all, Killer Ben, and a man from Crown Heights, Brooklyn, who the streets called 50 Cent. His real name was Kelvin Martin, and the reason they called him 50 Cent had nothing to do with money in the way most people think about money. Kelvin Martin would rob you. He would take your jewelry. He would take your valuables. He would take everything you had on you, and then he would leave you 50 cents. Not because he needed the money, because he wanted you to know that he had taken everything else and left you with almost nothing deliberately. The 50 cents was the message. The 50 cents was the humiliation. The 50 cents said this: I could have taken this too. I chose not to. That choice is mine. Your dignity is mine. It was psychological warfare, conducted one robbery at a time. His exploits became legendary across New York in the mid-1980s. They were covered by local media and referenced in hip-hop lyrics before any rapper named Curtis Jackson ever existed. When Curtis Jackson from Queens decided to take a stage name in the late 1990s, he didn't invent the name 50 Cent. He borrowed it, specifically, deliberately. He said so publicly. The name was inspired by Kelvin Martin, a 1980s Brooklyn robber known as 50 Cent. I chose it because it says everything I want it to say. 1988. Benjamin O'Garo is 19 years old. By now, his reputation in Fort Greene is fully established. His name circulates through the streets the way dangerous reputations circulate, through stories told on corners, through accounts passed between men in prison yards, through the oral history Brooklyn maintains about men who operate at the level Killer Ben operates. He is not yet 20 years old, and he is already someone that grown men in Fort Greene speak about carefully. Then, in a Fort Greene playground, he faces the situation that will define everything that follows. A shootout erupts. What started it is not fully documented in any public record. Disputes in that world rarely are. What is documented, reported by DNA Info, and circulated through every account of Killer Ben's life is what happened in the middle of it. Killer Ben, surrounded and under fire in a playground full of children, grabbed a 4-year-old child and used that child as a human shield, not in a moment of confusion that could be explained away. Deliberately, calculated, the child was cover. That detail became the defining fact of how the rest of his short life would be understood. In a world where violent men are judged by a specific code, where there are things you do and things you don't do, lines that even the most feared men are expected to respect, using a 4-year-old child as a shield crossed every line simultaneously. The people who respected Killer Ben respected him anyway. His reputation was too established, his standing too real, to be fully erased by one act. But the act was never forgotten, never fully defended. It sat in the middle of the Killer Ben mythology, the way uncomfortable truths sit, acknowledged, contextualized, and ultimately irreducible. He was convicted of attempting to murder a police officer, sentenced to federal prison. He went away in 1988 at age 19. He would not walk the streets of Fort Greene again for 7 years. And while he sat in that cell, The cost of being Killer Ben arrived at his family's door. 1990. Fort Greene, Brooklyn. Killer Ben is in prison. His brother, a younger man not connected to the street life the way Ben was, not someone who had chosen what Benjamin had chosen, gets into a dispute. A shootout. Details absorbed into the incomplete record that Fort Greene keeps about its most painful moments. But the men involved in that dispute know the family name. They know what it means. They know where the O'Garros live. That same night, they come to the front door. They shoot it up. Killer Ben's youngest brother, a child, is killed. An innocent boy. Never a gang member. Never involved in anything his older brother had built. Dead because of the name he carried at birth. Dead because reputation in that world does not stay contained to the person who earned it. It radiates outward to the family, to the address, to everyone associated with the name. Ben is somewhere in a federal prison when word reaches him. He cannot go home. He cannot bury his brother. He cannot be present for the grief that sweeps through his family. He cannot do the thing that every instinct he has developed over 19 years of life in Fort Greene tells him needs to be done next. He sits with it, in a cell, for years. The mural that Fort Greene would eventually paint in his honor, the bright-faced young man with the sharp jaw and the sharp hairline, the words "a cut above the rest" beneath his dates, does not show any of that weight. Murals show the legend, not what it cost. 1995. 7 years after he went in, Killer Ben comes home. Fort Greene has changed while he was gone. Or more accurately, it has continued the transformation that was already underway when he left. The crack epidemic has peaked and begun to give way to heroin. The open-air markets that had defined the late 80s drug trade are being restructured under the pressure of federal enforcement. But the streets are still the streets. And hip-hop, which had been an underground New York phenomenon when Killer Ben went to prison, has become something else entirely while he was away. Hip-hop is now public, visible, and profitable. Biggie Smalls is about to release Ready to Die, the debut album that will make Christopher Wallace from Bed-Stuy the most celebrated rapper in America. Jay-Z is recording in studios across Brooklyn. The Source Awards, the biggest annual night in hip-hop, are bringing the entire industry to Manhattan. And the artists moving through that world are wearing wealth publicly. Gold chains, diamond crosses, jewelry that cost tens of thousands of dollars, worn openly, displayed deliberately because the jewelry was both real wealth and proof of authenticity. It said, "I came from where I said I came from. I built what I said I built." Killer Ben looked at all of that and saw opportunity. Opportunity. His name was already part of the mythology. A popular 1991 song had mentioned him. Rakim had put him on an album cover. In the prison yards and on the corners where the real New York oral history lives, Killer Ben was a name that carried weight. But weight doesn't pay rent. He went back to what he knew, the streets of Fort Greene, the networks he had built before he went away, the fearlessness that had built his name, and he started robbing rappers. 1995, the Source Awards, Manhattan. The 1995 Source Awards are one of the most infamous nights in hip-hop history. The night Suge Knight took the stage and called out record executives who put themselves in their artists' videos, a thinly veiled shot at Diddy that ignited the East Coast-West Coast rivalry that would eventually cost both Tupac and Biggie their lives. That is the story everyone knows about that night. Here is the story nobody reported. Biggie Smalls is there with his junior mafia crew. An associate named Zach is wearing a gold chain. After the show, the chain is gone. No police report filed. No public acknowledgement. The kind of robbery that gets handled the way things get handled in that world, quietly, with the understanding that what happens next happens outside the legal system. Word comes back through the streets. Killer Ben had something to do with it. Benjamin O'Garrow, the man from the Walt Whitman houses, the man on Rakim's album cover, the man who had used a 4-year-old as a human shield and served 7 years and come home and gone straight back to the life, had robbed someone connected to the most famous rapper in New York. According to former NYPD detective and author Derek Parker, who documented this era in his book, Biggie and Killer Ben may have clashed directly in 1995, months before Ben was murdered. August 17, 1995, Myrtle Avenue, Fort Greene, Brooklyn. Benjamin O'Garrow is 26 years old. He is standing at a payphone on the street where he grew up, the street he went to prison from, the street he came home to, the street where he learned that mythology doesn't pay rent and went back to the life because the life was the only thing he fully knew how to do. He has been home from prison for less than a year. In that time, he has reestablished himself. The Source Awards robbery, the network of contacts he maintained through 7 years of federal incarceration, the reputation that had survived his absence and in some ways grown in it, because absence in that world sometimes amplifies a legend rather than diminishing it. He is standing at a payphone, having a conversation, and somewhere nearby, a man with a .40 caliber handgun is making his way toward Myrtle Avenue. The shot comes without warning. Benjamin O'Garrow is shot dead at the payphone on Myrtle Avenue in the Walt Whitman houses neighborhood, 2 blocks from where he was born. 26 years old. The murder was never solved. No arrest was ever made. The circumstances, whether it was retaliation for the Source Awards robbery and the chain taken from Biggie's associate Zach, whether it was connected to the reported direct clash between Killer Ben and Biggie in those final months of 1995, whether it was something else entirely from the long list of enemies that a man like Killer Ben accumulates over a life lived the way he lived it, were never publicly established. Former New York Police Department detective Derek Parker documented in his book that Killer Ben and Biggie may have clashed in the months before his death. Parker was a working homicide detective in Brooklyn during this era. His account is the closest thing to a documented record of what the relationship between Killer Ben and the bad boy world looked like in those final months, but nobody was ever charged. The case stays open in the same way that cases like this always stay open in Fort Greene. Technically active, practically cold, the truth somewhere in the oral history of the streets rather than in any police file. Killer Ben died the way he lived, on his street, in his neighborhood, with no warning and no time to react. The phone call he was making when the shot came, nobody knows who was on the other end of the line. Nobody knows what the last words of Benjamin O'Garrow were. Just the sound of a .40 caliber handgun on Myrtle Avenue. And then silence. Fort Greene, Brooklyn, today. On the corner of Vanderbilt and Myrtle Avenues, directly across from the Walt Whitman houses, where Benjamin O'Garrow was born, grew up, went to prison, and came home, there is a mural. His face, young, a bright-faced young man with a square jaw and a sharp hairline. The face of someone who never made it to 30, who never had the chance to become whatever a man like Benjamin O'Garrow might have become if the streets had given him more time. Above the image, the words that the people who loved him chose. Our never-ending love for you. Your memories will always shine through. Below the painting, a cut above the rest, and his dates. November 5th, 1968. August 17th, 1995, 26 years. That is all. The mural was painted by the community that knew him, that had grown up around him, that had watched him become Killer Ben and understood, the way communities that produce men like him always understand, that the legend and the man were two different things, that the man had a mother, had brothers, had a birthday and a childhood before he had a reputation. The mural was defaced by people who felt that painting a tribute to a man convicted of attempted murder who had used a 4-year-old child as a human shield was the wrong message for a neighborhood still trying to find its way forward. They had a point, and then the mural was repainted by people who felt that Fort Greene had the right to remember its own, in full, with complexity, without the sanitized version of history that pretends communities do not produce men like Killer Ben and do not grieve them when they are gone. They also had a point. Both things can be true simultaneously. The man was complicated. The legend was real. The grief was genuine. Fort Greene painted him back on the wall, and Rakim had already made sure that the name survived beyond the wall. The God MC, who changed what rap could be, who brought a level of lyrical intelligence to hip-hop that nobody had brought before, who is considered by serious students of the music to be the greatest rapper who ever lived, had put Killer Ben in his songs, had put him on his album cover, had acknowledged him as part of the world that produced both the music and the violence, the crack-era Brooklyn energy that defined everything Rakim was speaking to. Tragedy Gaddafi, one of the most respected lyricists in New York hip-hop, had put him in a verse, bidded with Killer Ben and the real 50 Men. The original 50 Cent, not Curtis Jackson, the real man who carried that name before it became one of the most famous brands in entertainment history, had run in the same circle. Kelvin Martin, Crown Heights, Brooklyn, the man who would rob you and leave you 50 cents because the 50 cents was the message, because your humiliation was part of the transaction, because the point was never just the money. Curtis Jackson named himself after that man, said publicly, "I'm the same kind of person 50 Cent was, the most commercially successful rapper of the 2000s, the man who turned Get Rich or Die Tryin' into 12 million album sales, the man who survived 9 bullets in a South Jamaica parking lot and used the story to build a global brand, named himself after someone from the same world as Killer Ben. That is the world Benjamin O'Garrow moved in. Not a footnote, not a cautionary tale. A man who was genuinely part of the cultural DNA of the era that produced the music your entire generation listened to. He robbed every rapper in New York. He got put on an album cover by the greatest MC who ever lived. His running partner's nickname became the most famous stage name in the history of rap music, and he died in a phone booth on Myrtle Avenue at 26 years old. The mural is still there, defaced and repainted. Fort Greene remembers. Not every paper trail is a court file or a federal case number. Sometimes it's something nobody expects to become a criminal record at all. A photograph, printed and distributed to millions of people, that ends up outliving every other document tied to the man in it, turning up decades later in places nobody involved could have predicted. That one immortalized a man almost by accident. The last case is the opposite. A paper trail built deliberately, piece by piece, by investigators who had nothing else to work with until the documentation finally caught up with him across an international border. Memphis, Tennessee, 2006. Somewhere in this city, 440 pounds of product is sitting in a room, guarded by one man trusted with a shipment worth millions of dollars, millions, belonging to the most dangerous kingpin Memphis has ever produced, and that one man decides to take it, all of it, 440 pounds, gone. Not skimmed, not shorted, gone. every brick, every bag, every dollar's worth, lifted out of the room by the man who was supposed to be watching it and carried into the night. The man who owns that shipment is sitting in Mexico, running an empire that stretches across 8 states from a house in Querétaro, ordering hits by phone, directing shipments by code, controlling the largest operation in the history of Memphis from 1,400 miles away. His name is Craig Petties, and when Craig Petties finds out what just happened, the thing he does next is going to leave a trail across the city that lasts for months. He is going to send his 2 most loyal men to the thief's house. There is going to be a confrontation. There is going to be a high-speed chase across the state line into Arkansas. A 3rd man is going to be sent. An innocent man is going to be snatched, held for 3 days at different houses across Memphis, and then taken out even after they believe he does not know anything. A man is going to threaten Petties' mother over what happened, and that man is going to be identified over a phone call from Mexico and taken out inside a crowded restaurant in broad daylight. A suspected informant is going to be ambushed at his own home with his children inside. All of it, everybody, every phone call from Mexico. All of it traces back to one theft, 440 pounds, one man, one decision. And here's the part that makes this story different from every other crime story you have ever heard. The man who stole it was never caught. Not by Petties, not by the killers, not by the police, not by anyone. Every person around him fell. People who had nothing to do with the theft were snatched, hurt, and taken out just for being in his orbit. The most violent organization in Memphis history tore the city apart looking for him. And Bobby Kraft vanished. This is the story of the man who stole 440 pounds from Craig Petties and lived, and the people who died because he did. This is that story. You have to understand who Craig Petties is to understand why stealing from him is not a crime. It is a death sentence. Craig Petties was born December the 11th, 1976, South Memphis, Riverside neighborhood, a tiny brick house his mother bought for $17,000. His mother made a little over $15,000 a year working as a foster parent and for the Board of Education in Shelby County. That was the family income, just above the poverty line. His half-brother, born 32 days after him, same father, different mother, would grow up to become DJ Paul of 3-6 Mafia, Grammy winner, Oscar winner, millions of records sold. Craig took the other road. By 15, he was already in the system. First arrest, 1991. A weapon he had bought to intimidate some boys who stole his coat. He accidentally set it off inside his own house and called the police himself to explain. That is the kind of teenager Craig Petties was. Reckless enough to bring a weapon home. Honest enough to call the cops about it. By 16, 2 arrests in one summer for selling product. By 17, a serious charge after an incident, handled in juvenile court, released after brief detention. And then at 18, the moment that built the empire. A top dealer in South Memphis got arrested. His Chevrolet Lumina was impounded at a lot with $500,000 hidden in a secret compartment. The dealer called Craig's cousin, Antonio Big Wayne Allen, from jail. "Get to the lot. Get the money out of the car before the police find it. I will give you a cut." Big Wayne had one problem. He was too heavy to climb the fence, so he sent Craig, 18 years old, small enough to scale a fence, bold enough to break into an impound lot to retrieve $500,000 that belongs to a man sitting in a cell. Craig climbed the fence, found the compartment, pulled the cash, and climbed back out. Then they double-crossed the dealer, kept all of it, split it among friends. Craig took $50,000 for himself, bought a Cadillac, gave his mother money to remove a tree from their yard, and invested the rest in product. That $50,000 is where the entire empire starts. Within a year, Craig Petties had outsold every other dealer in South Memphis. He rose to lead the Memphis branch of the Gangster Disciples. He met his two most loyal soldiers, cousins Clinton and Martin Lewis. Clinton they called Goldie, Martin they called M. Both teenagers, both willing to do anything Craig asked. By 22, Petties owned a house in the middle-class suburb of Hickory Hill, paid $185,000 for it, cash. He bought a Bentley for $339,000, a Mercedes for $112,000, property in Las Vegas, and then he connected to the source, Edgar Valdez Villarreal, La Barbie, a high-ranking leader in Mexico's Beltran Leyva cartel. The connection was cited by the DEA as the first time a black American had ever been accepted as a partner by a Mexican cartel. Not a buyer, a partner. Shipments came in on tractor-trailers through Interstates 55 and 40, 300 to 1,100 pounds at a time. One single shipment totaled 5,500 pounds with a street value of $50 million. Craig Petties, the kid who climbed a fence for $50,000, was now moving tens of millions a week through Memphis and 7 other states. And when the law started closing in, he did not run to a safe house. He ran to Mexico, bought a home in an upscale subdivision in Querétaro, and kept running the empire by phone. Every time the Mexican authorities got close, a corrupt employee at the United States Embassy tipped him off. He would move to a new city, change his phone, destroy the old one after every call. His lieutenants did the same. The DEA called it great phone discipline, the kind of operational security that kept him invisible for years. He was added to the U.S. Marshals' 15 Most Wanted list, featured on America's Most Wanted. And still, for 5 years, nobody could touch him. That is who Bobby Kraft stole from. A man sitting in Mexico with a cartel connection, a 15 Most Wanted listing, an army of men on speed dial, and a proven willingness to make anyone who crossed him disappear. And Bobby Kraft took 440 pounds of his product and disappeared. Now here is what happened to everyone except Bobby Kraft. The Lewis cousins got the call first. Clinton Goldie Lewis and Martin M. Lewis, Petties' most loyal enforcers, the men who had been with him since they were teenagers. When the word came from Mexico that Kraft had taken the shipment, the cousins were dispatched to Kraft's house. They did not knock. They descended on the property. It went loud. The whole block heard it. And then Kraft ran, out the back, into a vehicle. And what followed was a high-speed chase that crossed the city of Memphis, hit the highway, and did not stop until they were across the state line into Arkansas. They lost him. Clarence Brody was sent next, another one of Petties' enforcers, a man who had already proven what he was willing to do. Brody hunted Kraft through the streets, through the contacts, through anyone who might know where Kraft had gone. He could not find him either. Bobby Kraft had vanished, with 440 pounds, worth millions, and the most dangerous organization in Memphis could not lay a hand on him. But Petties does not stop looking. And when a man like Petties cannot find you, he starts finding the people around you. September 2006. Marcus Turner, 30 years old. Petties believed Turner knew where Bobby Kraft was hiding. Maybe they had a connection. Maybe somebody said a name. The reason does not matter. What matters is that Craig Petties, sitting in Mexico, picked up the phone and gave an order. Find Turner. Make him talk. They found him. 6 men. Clarence Brody, the Lewis cousins. Demetrius Fields, they called him Meat. Marcus Brandon, they called him White Boy. Carlos Whitelow, they called him Lizard. They snatched Marcus Turner off the street, and they went to work on him for 3 days, not 3 hours, 3 days, at different houses, moved from location to location across Memphis, asking the same question over and over. Where is Bobby Kraft? Where is the product? Where did he go? Turner kept saying he did not know. For 3 days, they hurt him. For 3 days, he told them the same thing. I do not know where Bobby Kraft is. On the 3rd day, they believed him, and then they took him out anyway. On September the 27th, 2006, the body of Marcus Turner was found dumped in a ditch just across the state line in Mississippi, just outside Memphis. 30 years old. Dead because somebody thought he might know where Bobby Kraft went. He did not know. They knew he did not know. They took him out anyway, because in Craig Petties' world, once you are in the room, you do not leave the room. And it did not stop, because what happened to Turner set off a chain reaction that proved exactly how far Craig Petties was willing to reach from 1,400 miles away. A man named Mario McNeil, 33 years old. When McNeil found out what had been done to Marcus Turner, he did something that, in any other world, would be understandable. He was furious, and he directed that fury at the one person he should never have mentioned. He threatened Craig Petties' mother. Now, Petties is in Mexico, 1,400 miles from Memphis. He cannot walk outside and handle this himself, but he does not need to. He has the phone, and the phone is the most dangerous weapon in this entire story. Petties calls Martin Lewis. March the 16th, 2007. Martin Lewis gets driven to a restaurant on the south side of Memphis. A regular spot. Afternoon, people eating. Normal day. Lewis walks in. He is on the phone with Carlos Whitelow. And Whitelow, who is somewhere else entirely, describes the target to Lewis over the phone. What he looks like, where he is sitting. A physical description relayed in real time so that the man can identify someone he has never seen before in a room full of strangers. Lewis spots him, and it happens. Inside a crowded restaurant, middle of the day, people eating at their tables. Then walks out. A man threatened Petties' mother. From Mexico, Petties made one phone call, and within hours, that man was gone. Identified by his clothes, in a restaurant, at lunch. That is what Bobby Kraft was running from. That is the machine he stole from and walked away from. And every body that dropped in his wake is proof that the only reason Kraft is alive is that he was smarter, faster, or luckier than every other person in this story. And there is one more, Mario Stewart, a member of the organization, suspected of being an informant. Petties gave the order. The first man assigned to do it was Orlando Pride. Pride and Stewart were friends, had history together, and one night, Pride went to Stewart's backyard to carry out the order. He stood there in the dark, and he could not do it. He walked away because of the friendship. Petties did not accept that. He assigned Clarence Brody instead, offered $50,000. In March of 2005, Fields drove Brody to Stewart's home in the suburbs. Brody found a way inside, and he waited. When Stewart came home, Brody was waiting. It happened at his own front door, with his children inside the house. And here is the detail that should chill you. The man who refused the hit, Orlando Pride, was later recorded in a conversation with Stewart before Stewart's death, confessing that Petties had ordered him to do it. Stewart was secretly recording him. Pride admitted on tape that he had stood in Stewart's backyard one night, ready to carry out the order, and backed down because of their friendship. That recording ended up in the federal case file. Pride's own voice, admitting to a hit he almost carried out, played back in a courtroom. The same thing that always gets them, their own words. And through all of this, every hit, every session, every phone call from Mexico, Every body dumped across state lines, the original cause of all of it, the man who pulled the first thread, the man who stole 440 pounds and set every domino falling, Bobby Kraft was nowhere. The Lewis cousins could not find him at the house. They could not catch him on the highway. Brody could not track him through the streets. The entire Petties organization, 40-plus members, cartel connections, corrupt embassy contacts, America's Most Wanted, the DEA, the FBI, the U.S. Marshals, none of them could find Bobby Kraft. And then in January of 2008, Craig Petties himself was arrested in Querétaro, Mexico. Along with a woman and 3 bodyguards, he was extradited to the United States. In 2009, he pleaded guilty to 19 charges, including 4 homicides. In 2013, a federal judge sentenced him to 9 life sentences, no possibility of parole. Over 40 members of his organization were convicted: the Lewis cousins, Brody, Fields, Whitelow. All of them, the largest drug case in Memphis federal court history, dismantled piece by piece. And the strangest detail in the entire case is one that has nothing to do with the violence. Craig Petties' half-brother is DJ Paul. From 3-6 Mafia, same father, born 32 days apart. One grew up to win a Grammy, to win an Oscar, to stand on a stage in Hollywood and accept an Academy Award for a song called "It's Hard Out Here for a Pimp." A song about the life his own brother was living for real while he was making music about it. 3-6 Mafia sold over 6 million albums. DJ Paul became one of the most successful figures in Memphis music history. Craig Petties got 9 life sentences. Same blood, same city, same father, same starting line. One brother made a song about the life. The other brother lived it, bled for it, and will die in a federal cell because of it. DJ Paul spoke on it once, years later. "They set my brother up," he said. "They took my brother." Whether that is grief-talking or truth, it is the one public statement from the famous brother about the brother the world was never supposed to know about. The brother whose name you will not find in any 3-6 Mafia interview, any album liner notes, any behind-the-scenes documentary. He exists in the court record and nowhere else in the public eye. The trial itself was something Memphis had never seen. The jury's identity was kept secret, not just sealed, secret. Only the defense attorneys and the federal prosecutors were allowed to know who sat in that box, because the judge believed that if Petties' associates or the Mexican cartel learned the jurors' names, those jurors would be in danger. Think about that. A federal judge in an American courtroom deciding that the jury has to be anonymous because the defendant's organization is so dangerous that knowing who convicted him could put you in danger. During the trial, Petties stood up and said one thing to the families of the people who were gone because of him: "I apologize for the decisions I made in life." 9 life sentences, no parole. He is currently serving them at USP Allenwood, a high-security federal prison in Pennsylvania. He will die there. And Bobby Kraft, the man who started it all, the man who stole 440 pounds and set off a chain that left people across 2 states. As far as the public record shows, Bobby Kraft was never caught by Petties' organization. He was never touched. He took 440 pounds from a man who made people disappear for far less, and he walked away with his life. Marcus Turner did not walk away. He was held for 3 days and taken out for knowing nothing. Mario McNeil did not walk away. He was identified by his clothing and taken out inside a restaurant. Mario Stewart did not walk away. He was taken out at his own home with his children inside. Orlando Pride did not walk away. His own confession was played back to him in a federal courtroom. Craig Petties did not walk away. He got 9 life sentences. The Lewis cousins did not walk away. Life in prison, 40-plus people. Exposed, convicted, sentenced, gone. And Bobby Kraft, the man whose theft triggered the entire chain, is the one name in this story that never shows up in a sentencing hearing. 440 pounds, one decision, a trail of bodies that stretches from Memphis to Mississippi to Arkansas to Mexico. And the man who started it all is the only one who walked away clean. Subscribe to Bloody Reports. There are 1,000 stories like this one that nobody has told the right way yet. This was one of them. 4 men, 4 different kinds of paperwork, a federal file, a missing persons case that's technically still open, a photograph nobody asked permission to take, and a manhunt built one document at a time until there was nowhere left to hide. None of them planned for the paper trail. That's exactly why it worked. The crime is always the part people plan for. The getaway, the alibi, the silence. Almost nobody plans for the version of themselves that ends up written down, filed, and kept long after they've stopped thinking about it at all. Think about what these 4 cases actually have in common, laid next to each other like this. A DEA agent filling out a report has no idea at the time that it will still be the only lead on a case 50 years later. A record label choosing a cover photo has no idea it's creating the single most durable piece of evidence connected to a robbery from years earlier. Nobody sits down and decides to build the document that eventually becomes the reason a case gets solved, or stays open, or gets remembered at all. It happens as a byproduct of somebody else simply doing their job, and that's exactly what makes it impossible to plan around. 4 different men, 4 different decades, 4 completely different kinds of paperwork. Not one of them saw it coming, and not one of them could have stopped it once it existed. The full versions of every story in this video are on the channel right now.